What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and to learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in this week's episode is entrepreneur, author, and founder of the Forward Party, Andrew Yang. Most of you, if you're American citizens or if you live in the United States, probably already know who Andrew is. He's the guy who popularized the idea of universal basic income, what he called the freedom dividend, during his run for president in 2020. And despite the plethora of candidates on offer during the Democratic primary, Andrew really stood out as one of the most dynamic and energizing candidates in the field. I invited him on the podcast today because he recently announced the launch of the Forward Party, a new political party focused on breaking what Andrew sees as a two-party duopoly that is no longer working and whose members and policies have fallen increasingly out of favor with the majority of Americans. He details many of his policy proposals in his new book, Forward, including ranked choice voting, open primaries, term limits, campaign reform, and of course, universal basic income, $1,000 for every man and woman in America. We spent most of the first half of our conversation discussing Andrew's experience on the campaign trail, what it was like to run for president, and what it taught him about our political system and how to go viral in today's attention economy. The overtime is where I had the opportunity to really dig into Andrew's policy platform. We got to discuss his proposals on UBI, their potential impact on inflation, and how to implement such policies without making politics even more transactional than it is today. We also discuss how to crack the gerontocracy of the existing power structure, the misaligned incentives in our media, as well as how Andrew thinks blockchain and distributed ledger technology can be leveraged for the public good, and why crypto is a potential path to universal basic income. If you enjoy the free content that we produce every week, I encourage you to take the leap and become a premium subscriber if you haven't already. There's no commitment, you can cancel at any time, and the entire library of subscriber content going all the way back to episode 1 becomes instantly available to you, including the overtimes, afterthoughts, transcripts, and rundowns, depending on your tier. So without any further ado, please enjoy this week's forward-looking episode with my guest, Andrew Yang. Andrew Yang, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Great to be here. Time to expose some hidden forces.
Yeah, exactly.
Good to be here, Demetri.
I'm really excited to have you on, man.
It's great to be here. It seems like you have very, very intelligent discussions with really deep thinkers. So I felt like, wow, I can try to be a deep thinker for an hour.
Well, actually, we've had some similar guests. I mean, on your podcast, I saw that it seems, and we'll get into this because this is one of the questions I wanted to ask you, but it seems that after you finished your run for president in 2020, or maybe towards the end of that campaign, you began to do a sort of deep dive into try to understand better, maybe intellectually, some of the things that you were witnessing on the campaign trail that we were seeing in the country. For example, your conversation with Jonathan Haidt, Lawrence Lessig. It looks like you guys know each other a long ways, but you had him on the podcast. So you did some work to try and understand the issues that you then write about in your book. So you've also, congrats on the book. I read it. I really enjoyed it. It was not what I expected.
Wait, let me check for a sec. What did you expect and what was it? Because, I haven't had many of these conversations.
I expected it to fall within the framework that's traditionally what you tend to find with these types of books, which is there's this problem, here's the solution, I'm the guy for the solution, vote for me. And I didn't find it to be structured that way. Actually, I found it to be, it's structured, I would say the book's broken into 3 parts. The first part is what I assume is entirely the result of diary entries or journaling that you did during the course of the campaign in 2020.
So I just want to say, Demetri, I had 0 journal entries or reflection during the campaign, which I wish I had, or that would have made life a little easier. But as it was, I had to, because when you were running for president, at least in my case, I did not have any moment to sit and like, like what's going on here? Anyway, continue. So the first is...
Well, that's interesting. I had an experience where I tried to piece together a period of my life, and that was actually easier than I thought it would be because of social media and everything. I
could find a lot of shit on myself.
Right, exactly.
I'd be like, so what was that going on there? And I could be like, oh, and then
exactly.
watch the recording.
So I felt that the first part, the first 80 pages or so, the first third of the book was that. The second part was really sort of outlining what the problems were. And then the third part was sort of focused on solutions. Your second to last chapter, I think it was called Grace and Tolerance, that took me by surprise. And that's, I think, why it didn't follow in that structure. I was expecting towards the very end for you to make that case. Instead, what you did was, in a very genuinely authentic, compelling way, humanized yourself, but without, it didn't feel like you were making a point. And that's what made it so compelling, in my view, and also made it so refreshing. And I do want to talk to you about that chapter, and I've made a point to ask you about it. But that's how I would describe my experience of reading the book. It was like a real human being who did something really weird, which is run for president, and then wrote about it, and then honestly reflected on what he felt were the problems that we faced, which are very serious.
Very serious.
And then put forward what I think are some interesting, innovative, some of them very promising solutions, I think, and then kind of left it open. You didn't really tie it off and say, okay, here it is. It's sort of like you left it open. You're like, let's start a conversation. And that's what I felt the book was. That was my experience of it.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. That makes me very happy. I haven't actually talked to that many people who've read my book as yet, as it's been out only for, a week or so. And I'm happy to dig into any of the ideas. I do think we're at a very dangerous point in American life where if everyone does what is reasonable and rational according to their incentives, we are completely and totally fucked. That's something that I probably don't put it in those words in the book, but I try and lead people there, being like, hey, FYI, like all the systems are going to literally turn us on each other and make us crazier and crazier.
Right. Well, that's what Van Jones told you in a conversation you guys had, right? Not long ago. And that question I wanted to ask you because I don't understand what that means. So what did he mean by that? And what do you mean by if everyone does what's in their rational self-interest, we're all fucked? What does that mean?
So I start with the political incentives, where if you are a member of Congress, congratulations. Right now, 28% of Americans are happy with U.S. Congress, which probably isn't shocking to people listening to this. So 7 out of 10 of us are like, things aren't going well. But the re-election rate for individual members of Congress is 92%, which is a very, very high percentage. And so you have to look at it and say, why is it that we can all be unhappy with what's going on with the body, but my individual member is assured of re-election if he or she decides to run again? And the reason is that in 83% of the districts around the country, it's very Democratic or very Republican, very blue or very red. So the game is not to win a general election. The game is just to avoid getting primaried in your own party. And if you get through the primary, then you win in 83% of these contests. So your incentives then are not to try and deliver or compromise or make 51% of the people in your district happy. It's just to avoid getting challenged and primaried among the 20% most extreme, hyper-partisan, and I'm going to say it, fucking weird people in your district. And so then if you're a member of Congress, what's the game plan? It's like, well, let me keep my head down and chill out and go along with the party line. So you can have hundreds of legislators just kind of shrugging and being like, I guess we're going to do something weird this time. And that's actually, or not do anything, or, not like raise the debt ceiling or whatever stupid shit is going on in Washington at any moment. And so that actually becomes rational for you because of keeping your job. And there are distortions on both sides, though I think the distortions are right now worse on one side than the other. And then the media incentives are around inflaming people and pissing them off and separating them into ideological camps because your ratings are better, ad rates are better, everything's better if you have a consistent audience. And if you just reported straight down the middle news and you didn't have an ideological point of view, then people are like, I don't really need this every night. But if you're getting red meat or blue meat every night, blue meat, I made that shit up. But if you're getting that stuff every night, then you're like, ooh, yeah. And then you get ginned up into some sort of moral conflict where now 42% of Democrats and Republicans see the other side as their quote unquote mortal enemies or quote unquote downright evil. And then you have social media pouring gasoline on the whole thing. And so if everyone in the media does what's in their own interests, we're going to get more and more pissed off and dysfunctional. If everyone in politics does what's in their interest, we're going to get more and more broken. And that's where we are right now in American life. Oh, and if everyone on social media does what's going to get them maximal engagement, then they're just going to become more shrill and crazy.
So does that suggest to you that we have an incentives problem in America today?
Oh, yeah, we have a fundamental incentives problem. I mean,
across the board, not just in politics, not just in media, but in general, that there's a misalignment in the incentives in the most sort of the basic area, whether it's economics, politics, media, technology, et cetera.
Sure.
And that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, it's tough to address. I mean, there are things you could do. I'm going to suggest that at the scale we're looking at, you probably do need something relatively dramatic. I campaigned for president on universal basic income, which I think would at least give people a bit of a transitional opportunity. But you could look at just about any field. I'll use tech as just an example. Let's say that I am starting a scrappy young company. 20 years ago, my goal might have been to become the next Hewlett-Packard or the next Google or whatnot. But now that's completely unrealistic given the way that the industry looks. And so what is my business plan now? Try and get to a point where I get the attention of one of the giants and then get acquired for hundreds of millions of dollars or maybe even more by one of the giants, who, by the way, are now worth like $1 trillion. So for them, they look around and say, hey, there's this company, it's coming up, maybe just throw $1 billion on it. Or if it's a very, in a small scale, they might just throw 10 million on it just to absorb the engineers. So if you're a company that's up and coming and you get a $100 million offer, you should take that because your investors 100% will be like, take it. Because like that'll be their win. Maybe they projected a bigger win. Maybe it's $1 billion. And so you have a very rational system that will reward investors, reward to some extent founders, to a lesser extent employees of the company. But it's going to lead to a handful of firms just dominating, which, by the way, is what we see right now. And so you can fancy the fact it's like, oh, there'll be a disruptor in the garage. But at this point, if the disruptor in the garage gets any traction, eventually someone will come with a check. And then it's very much in their interest to take the check. And, I don't begrudge anyone from taking the check, but I'm just throwing out a series of events that has led in a particular direction.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's fair to say what you're describing is an anti-competitive landscape characterized by intense amounts of corporate concentration. You know what? I want to shelve that a second because I want to talk about that when we discuss problems. But I want to take this from the top because, like I said in the book, and I didn't mention also, a lot of people will know this, and I'll have mentioned in the introduction that you launched a Forward Party as well the same day that you launched the book. I don't know that you're the first person. I mentioned there are other people that probably launched their campaigns. Maybe Ross Perot launched his campaign when he launched his first book. I'm curious, how much of a student of history are you? And how much did you study independently the history of independent campaigns and independent candidates? Because you were born in the mid-1970s, so you would have been politically...
I remember Perot, if that's what you're asking, for sure. I don't know if you remember Perot.
I do remember Perot. I was a kid. I would have been 10 years old, but I absolutely remember Perot. And I remember at the time I was living in Pennsylvania, in York, Pennsylvania, which was a big Perot town. I don't know if they voted overwhelmingly for Perot, but I remember people really were all about Ross Perot at the time. I did a little bit of digging before our conversation. He was absolutely one of the most successful independent party candidates ever, and the most successful by far, barring anyone who was previously president, because TDR was previously president when you ran with the Bull Moose Party in, I think, 1916. So did you do any amount of research to sort of see where, as part of an effort, because you were so methodical, and this is the other thing I really loved about the first part of the book, where you talk about your experience of running for president, you were very methodical in the way you approached it. You also did a really cool job I think of it as like the capoeira of like the political handbooks for running a political presidential election insurgency, the first part, because you don't explicitly explain to people how to do it, but you kind of do that in a way. So like, was that something that when you went through this research phase after the end of the campaign where you talked to people, did you reflect on the history of independent party runs ahead of launching this party?
So if you look at the book, I wrote it after I came off the presidential, and I was trying to figure out why things are not working, why it feels so dysfunctional and broken. And I concluded that it feels that way because it is that way and it's designed to be that way. That if you imagine that our government is designed to solve problems and be rational and proactive, it turns out it's not. It turns out right now it's designed to clash until we're at each other's throats and we witness violence in our streets of a political nature, unfortunately, on a scale that most people would find hard to fathom. But one thing I said at a book talk last night is that at this point in American life, we should think that everything is possible. And when I say that, I mean generally on the downside, like the most like terrible things you can imagine. It's like, yeah, that's actually a possibility. And then if you question that, then you can think, wait a minute, I've already seen some things that people would have found unthinkable not that long ago. Mm-hmm. So I was doing my research, and there were a number of thinkers that influenced me profoundly, like you mentioned, Lawrence Lessig, Jonathan Haidt, Catherine Gale, Ezra Klein, had written these books, and there were a number of things that came out of it. One of them is that politics is now just tribal. It's not policy disagreements. It turns out the correlation between the way I identify myself politically and what I think about various policies is very low. It's only 0.25. It's not the one correlation that you imagine where it's like, I'm some kind of white paper genius. It's very low. And so people are voting along media tribes, among brand associations. And I felt this acutely when I was running for president, walking around Iowa, which now, unfortunately, is like a state that's struggling in various ways. And so I would say I'm a Democrat. People would blanch like I'd, just shot someone in front of them. I'm now an independent. I think most people listening to this may know this. But it was just like an exposure of the fact that the parties just have a very, very strong association. And those associations now are pitted against each other in a way that is going to lead us to eventual violence and conflict. And so I started to unpack, okay, like what could you do to try and change this? And one of the interesting things, Demetri, is like now when I talk about this set of issues, I talk about things I do not talk about in the book around the history of our country, the fact that the founding fathers hated political parties, the fact that the Constitution doesn't have anything about political parties.
The founders were deeply concerned about factions.
No, but so when you talk about like my studying, here's what I came to, and this is the way my mind works, is that when you look at the structures, you realize that it's not designed to work, and that the only way we'd have a chance is to actually amend the structures in a significant way. And what the amendment I propose, which I know we'll probably get to, is open primaries and ranked choice voting, which would create a multipolar system instead of the duopoly. And one of the things I don't have in me as a human is to say, hey, here's a problem, and then here's a solution, and someone should do something about that. Like, I just don't have it in me to be the person that just hand waves at a problem and is like, yeah, someone do that. Because at this point in American life, there aren't that many someones who are actually going to do something about it. And then if you draw it up and you think, if they were to be a list of people, I would probably be on that list. And so really, it was the intellectual case of the brokenness of the system and its need for some kind of significant restoration or amendment or transformation that led me to think, okay, the Forward Party should exist, champion open primaries and ranked choice voting, give rise to a multipolar system, and I need to lead it and create it. And so what's funny about it, Demetri, is that the book and the process of writing it actually brought me in this direction and then established the timing, because the book comes out and then you're like, okay, we're doing the thing, because, the book's going to be read by hopefully, hundreds of thousands of people.
So, okay, you gave a little bit of an account of what it was like to run for president. Feel free to share anything else you like, but how has your understanding of what it's like to run for president changed? Like obviously, social media has dramatically transformed what's possible. We saw that most prominently in the campaign with Donald Trump. I mean, there wasn't social media with Howard Dean, but I feel like Howard Dean was the first internet celeb video presidential candidate. Barack Obama really took advantage of that, and then Trump took it to the next level. How do you think that running for president has changed? And do you feel that in and of itself provides avenues for candidates like you to emerge?
What's interesting, Demetri, is I am fairly convinced that to the extent there is a weak spot in our system of, frankly, just suppressing people, where the only people that are going to have a chance in 99% of races are going to be someone from the Democratic or Republican Party. And so if you were to have some kind of wild card in a congressional race, most people aren't going to care. Like, you actually have a better shot in a national context of generating a lot of attention for someone who's a little bit off the beaten track, like I was. I mean, I ran in a Democratic primary. I'd been a registered Democrat, but people didn't really think of me as much of a Democrat. And there are good reasons why. I mean, and as now I'm an independent, like, because
When you
like,
say people didn't
really
think
have,
of you as a Democrat, who are you referring to, the public or people within the political establishment? Because one of the things that you talk about in the book quite openly is just how much you feel that you were censored by the sort of partisan media establishment and by the Democratic Party. So how far did that reach?
Well, that's what I mean, is that there is a managed process. And if you're from outside of the machine, they're not going to be excited about you. That can be like, oh, who is this new character? Let's like give him some time to talk. It is the opposite dynamic. And so in a congressional race, that just means that there's going to be no oxygen. No one's going to give a shit. You'll have an incumbent who has, again, like a 92% chance of winning and like a $2 million moat. And then if you're a rando who shows up, like, not going to be local media, like no one cares. And so on a national level, it's harder for the establishment media to manage the process. I'll say, too, on a local level, there just isn't much media anymore. You know, like 2,000 local papers have gone out of business. No one's going to care about that election anyway. Our politics are becoming increasingly nationalized. And so to the extent that there is like an opportunity for something new, it probably is at a national level, which is ironic because you'd think that would be the last place. You'd think that it would be easier locally. But I think it's actually easier nationally.
What do you think it takes to bring someone out? And what do you think people vote on today?
People primarily vote on tribes today. No, like you have a D next to your name, you have an R next to your name. It used to be that 22% of Americans would cross party lines. That number is down to 7%, which is unfortunate. Though self-identified independents outnumber Democrats and Republicans almost 2-1. The number is something like 44, 29, 28, something like that. But it's primarily tribal. And that's one of my big takeaways from the experience, is that I thought I was talking really, I just talk the way I talk. And there were a lot of facts and figures involved about the automation of 4 million manufacturing jobs and all this stuff. And it turns out that my language just became a different political language, a political language for people who like facts and figures. And that proportion, I'm going to guess, is something like 10 to 15%.
Well, you said you would use a PowerPoint presentation at your State of the Union address, which was hilarious. There were actually a lot of funny parts. The book was actually extremely funny, man. Like when you talked about how you ran around saying that you're half a Bernie when you guys raised half as much as him in the quarter, or when your campaign manager who wanted you to do a wardrobe change, and you told them that no one cares how I look. Bernie literally looks like the scientist from Back to the Future, which also kind of, the thing is, there's also a generational component to this. I'm technically a millennial, you're a Gen Xer, but I do think there's so much that's relatable in your book, whether it's like going to the arcade to play Street Fighter or kind of the stuff that you were into growing up. How much do you think is also that there's a large constituency of people today who can relate to how you grew up? Because you talk about in the book the age issue, the fact that there's like Congress is a gerontocracy. How much do you think that's to your advantage? And again, you've launched a party, you haven't announced if you're running for president. How much of that do you think is an advantage for you in competing in the field and reaching out to people who maybe don't feel motivated to participate, but are looking for a reason to get engaged?
It was very heartwarming to me, Demetri, that so many people came to me and said, hey, you got me into politics. Hey, you got me out of a depression, is the best thing ever to hear. And a lot of those people were young. A lot of people who are children of immigrants tell me that I made them interested. I will say that the Forward Party right now is laser focused on trying to get open primaries and ranked choice voting in 2022. People imagine that I launched the Forward Party for 2024, and really it's all about right now trying to change the incentives of our leaders in 2022. Because I don't think we have much time, truly. And I'm happy to talk about why I think that those incentives need, I guess we touched on why those incentives need to change. I can talk about why open primaries would help. But
No, I
that's,
mean, I want to talk about both in more detail, as well as your proposal, what you call democracy dollars, which is giving people money that they can allocate specifically and only towards candidates of their choice in order to kind of, I suppose, in a way, get around the concentration, not just Citizens United, but the concentration of money in politics around the interests of, wealthy donors and large corporations. So let's start there, and then we'll circle back to some other things, because when I asked you about what do you think determines people's voting behavior, I want to actually dig deeper beyond just the parties, because you've mentioned some things that I actually tend to agree with in the past. But let's just to create some structure here, let's talk about ranked choice voting first, because that's a big one that you've identified. We'll also talk about UBI, another big one that you've identified. But let's talk about ranked choice voting. First of all, what is it and why is it important?
Ranked choice voting is a more modern voting system where you can rank up to 5 candidates in order of preference. You can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You could just order 1. And the first person who gets 50.1% of votes wins, which makes sense because if you get a majority of votes in any system, you should win. And ranked choice voting is so powerful because it gets rid of the spoiler effect. It discourages negative campaigning. It encourages ideological diversity. It can give rise to minor party candidates and independents being able to compete. Because right now you have these closed environments, and if someone comes along and says, hey, I'm an independent, then everyone yells, well, oh, you're going to screw things up for this party or that party. Because if someone votes for you, then they, quote unquote, steal votes from someone else. But if you have ranked choice voting, then you can rank the minor party candidate 1, and then whichever major party candidate you prefer 2, and then no wasted votes. Then if the minor party candidate doesn't win. And so
because your votes get reallocated to your second choice.
Yeah. So what this enables is people to vote their true preferences. If you really like one person, you just vote for that person and walk out. But if you were like, look, I really like this person, but my fallback is this person, then that preference is stated. So this change to ranked choice voting is what we need in order to reduce the polarization and encourage real diversity of point of view. And in my view, needs to be joined ideally with open primaries so that you have no party control over who's in the process. People just raise their hand and say, I'm a Republican, I'm forward party, I'm an independent, whatever you are. And then whoever gets the most support wins, and there are no spoilers. So that is the big change in our democracy, which, by the way, would improve the incentives of everyone in the process, because then you would have to appeal to 51% of voters in your district as opposed to the craziest 20 or 10.
Yeah, I do think there's a good case to be made that it would increase the quality of our politics. But why necessarily the polarization? Why would that reduce polarization in our country?
So let's say right now I'm running in a Democratic primary, Republican primary. And so the people that are voting are the 10 to 20% most hyper-partisan among them. And then I go in there and then they have very extreme points of view. And then you're like, okay, I'm down with whatever extreme point of view because I need to keep the 10% of you happy. Now, let's say
You're saying it would increase participation. It would make people feel like they can actually vote their choice and bring more people into the process, and by doing that would reduce polarization.
No, it's even better than that, Demetri. So politicians will do what gets them elected, 99 times out of 100. So who's going to be electing me? Is it going to be the 20% of the most extreme partisans in that district? And then when I go in, let's say there's like a very, very extreme point of view. I'm actually going to throw something out around like election integrity. It's like, I don't believe the vote count. And then in a particular district, a majority of Republicans are like, yeah, that election was stolen. I don't believe the vote count. And then you show up and say, I agree. Election was stolen. I don't believe the vote count, because that's what's going to either get you elected or reelected. Mm-hmm. Let's say that 20% of the people in your district or 30% feel the election was bullshit. Trump should still be president, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if I say the exact same thing with an open primary and ranked choice voting, let's say there are 25, 30% of people who are on board like, yeah, that was bullshit. Election was stolen. But then I can't win because the other 2/3 will be like, wait a minute, like, I don't agree with that. And I need to get to 51% on people's ballots. So because I'm dealing with 100% of the electorate, I need to get 51% to at least accept me. Then I'm going to hew away from an extreme point of view that a minority of people in my district might feel very, very strongly about, but 51% aren't down. And so you see, just by changing the incentive, that person will show up. And then if someone's like, oh, that election was bullshit, instead of being like, yeah, it was bullshit, they'll be like, we really should check that out and they will look into it. Like it just makes everyone more reasonable and it rewards reasonableness. Right now, we're rewarding extremity and then we're getting extremity.
Mm-hmm. How long do you think this has been going on? First of all, maybe a better way to ask that question is, when would you say that you began to become politically aware, that politics began to interest you?
I always had an interest in politics in the sense that, I'd read articles and, like I just felt like as an educated person, I should try and keep up with stuff. I never went hardcore until I ran, honestly. I mean, before then, like I'd voted in national elections, I donated a bit of money, but I didn't go that hardcore. But I did read about stuff. Like I enjoyed keeping up with it. I mean, my parents weren't into politics at all. I'm the son of immigrants, so it's not like there was a deep political heritage in my family.
It's so interesting. You kind of threw yourself into this process. I wonder, it would seem, both from having watched your campaign and from, again, having read your book, especially certain chapters, that has worked in your favor. Because I don't think that, again, this is not actually a revolutionary thing to say, and I don't think it's going to come as a shock to people. I think people are tired of politicians. Now, at the same time, people that know how the system works are important. But in America as a country has always sort of gone through phases of rewarding people, outsiders. We love outsiders, whether it was Ronald Reagan or Ross Perot. We mentioned Ross Perot.
Who got 19.3% of the vote in 92. So, I think if you were to rerun that stuff, he might get significantly higher than that, truly.
Truly, he could absolutely have won in 2016. So it's interesting to me, and I think that's also one of the things that makes you compelling to people, because politicians today feel very, as you've talked about in your book and in other interviews, disconnected, robotic. But then we get to a problem again, which is you seem like a really nice guy and you seem like an empathic human being. And that's something that people like. They like to connect. And that might, let's say, potentially make you a viable candidate along with your proposed policies. But then we get into a problem, which is that what tends to happen is, even if you like the candidate, and even if his ideas resonate with you or her ideas resonate with you, you send the person to Washington and they get integrated, absorbed into the Borg.
Yep.
How much time have you devoted to, and how do you think about this problem of changing the system? Ranked choice voting is a unique example because of the fact that you can do it through referendum. And is that sort of, I think you've also referred to it as the skeleton key for that reason. Talk to me about how you realistically think we can change this system.
Oh, I'm happy to review for a moment why it is that politicians all seem like robots. And the main reasons that they seem like robots is that they're surrounded by staffers who, anytime they do something that has any risk or controversy associated with it, tell them not to do it. Because the staffers would rather lose professionally than have anything weird happen. It's like their job's on the line. And if you're surrounded by these people and they're telling you like, hey, just say this, just say this, just say this all the time, then you're like, all right, let me just say this. And then the moment you do something a little bit off the reservation, you get attacked, your staff comes to you and be like, hey, you fucked up. And then you're like, oh, all right. So that's... You're saying
the influence of the staff on the politician is actually greater than most people realize?
The staff and consultants. What you have to look at is that there's an industry surrounding each of these figures. Like a Senate campaign costs $10 million on average, and like now it's going to be a lot higher in a lot of places. So that like you're part of this political industrial complex, and the political industrial complex consists very, very significantly of political professionals who, anytime there's a significant amount of money that's going to get spent or made, they're there. And so I'll give you my campaign's example, and maybe I could have gone. I mentioned this in passing in my book, but I don't dig in that far. So we're running around, we're doing our thing, we're trying to raise money, and everyone's like, no one gives a shit, like certainly from the political class.
Now, when is this? What period of time we're talking about here?
2018. We raised, like 600,000, something like that. Like no one cares.
Is that when you made the decision to run, 2018?
I decided in 2017 and announced early 2018, and no one gave a shit. And that was cool. And then I just had to take my case to people and come on podcasts like this one and like grind it out and, let people know it's like, look, it's not in your head. Like, technology is real. Other stuff. But like my campaign, I learned so much. It was so invigorated. And I learned just how fucked we are. It's like all just kind of smashed together. And I tried to convey it in my book. Okay. So circa 2019, you talked about how I was like half a Bernie at the end of 2019. So we raised $16.5 million in that quarter. And which means then you're like, okay, how the hell do I deploy $16.5 million as quickly as I can to try and win Iowa, win New Hampshire? And so a phalanx of political consultants shows up and is like, all right, here's a deal. We got to shoot some ads. We got this media buyer. Like we've got this data on like where to try and promote you in Iowa. And here are the messages that are going to work. And let's poll test some shit. And let's do all this stuff. Now, I'm a rational dude. I like data, so I'm like, all right, cool. And then you have this small army of people around you who are like, here's a message, go, go, go. And then if you do anything that's off that script, then the people around you are like, hey, you fucked up. Like, don't do that again. Don't do that again. And, and you're a human.
Can you talk to me? Tell me a little bit about that. Explain that to me. Explain it to me what that conversation, because I don't understand that. When you say you fucked up, you get back on message. Humanize that conversation for me so that me and the audience can understand what that's like.
Well, here's one thing I remember, and this probably is not the best example. No, let me think of a better example. The example that came to my mind was I was in New Hampshire and like a dude was like, hey, when you like take this whipped cream can and do a whip it. And I was like, sure. And then I do that and it becomes like a major news story. And I'm like, what the fuck?
That worked for you. That worked for you.
Well, I'm glad you thought so, Demetri. But
well, I don't know about that specific one, but you gave great examples in the book where that sort of, and maybe they weren't as impromptu as they appeared, whether it was you like, dancing or doing, you had these viral moments and you spoke very honestly, I felt in the book, about those because you conveyed your own, understanding in real time that this was actually beneficial to you and to your campaign because you wanted to talk about the issues, you felt the issues were important, but you understood that in order to get any kind of attention, you had to create these viral moments. You had to humanize yourself. You had to become interesting to the machine. And therein lies that dilemma, right? Which is that the incentives don't align with what we need, and yet you have to find a way to walk that line.
Yes. So to the extent that there's a moment like that, cut negatively, then there's someone around you who's like, hey, don't say this, say this, like say this, say this. And then, you look at it and say, okay. And the tough part is that, let's say you're a good guy, which, I like to think I am. And there are people who are working hard on your behalf and they have jobs on the line and some of them want a future and the rest of it. And so, saying, fuck off, like I'm just doing whatever the fuck I want, is not like, winning culture material. So, you try and be like, okay, now then you just have to try and moderate it. But the people who are real repeat players in this are pretty mercenary. They're going to show up. They're going to like make money off of you. They're going to move on to the next candidate, et cetera, et cetera. So they genuinely, again, are much, much more content losing professionally than doing high variance things that might give you a chance to win.
Interesting. So let me see if I understand that. That speaks to the political industrial complex you were describing, right? Which is that you have your team, you've got your guys, the people that are your core team that you brought with you, but then you have to hire people that know what they're doing. And those people that you bring in are in some ways risk averse.
Very risk averse.
And they're not necessarily primarily motivated with you winning. That's a really great convex payoff, but at base level, they're in this as career people in the space, and they want to be able to transition to whatever's next. And they may not be fully willing to go for it, to believe that you're really going to win because you're such a dark horse candidate, especially in that context.
Yeah, the comparison I make is like NFL coaches. Like NFL coaches of bad teams. Like I think if I was a coach of a bad team, I'd be just doing fucking crazy shit all the time. Because like we're going to lose guys. We might as well like lose big and give ourselves a chance to win. Mm-hmm. But like the political consultant class are like very conservative NFL coaches where it's like, I'd rather lose by 9 and look like we did good than like do crazy shit all the time. So yeah, there's like that dynamic that gets built up very powerfully.
So then that brings us back to a question I asked you earlier, which is that given social media and technology and how you can scale everything today, does that make this class of individuals less significant than they would have been in the past and the system in general, because the forces of populism unleashed through technology are able to play such a powerful role in giving a candidate a platform. We saw that with Donald Trump. Donald Trump had an existing media presence, no doubt about it, and that was huge. But he was able to leverage social media. And there have been some other people as well, whether it's Ocasio-Cortez, or there are actually not that many. I mean, AOC is a great example, who really intuitively understand social media and are able to leverage it. Do you think that that's a tool that's worked to your advantage and that you can use to actually, let's say, run a leaner campaign than other candidates?
Well, certainly for me, it helped me contend a national scale. We raised $40 million and beat out half a dozen political brand names, and none of that happens without social media and the rest of it in my case. But to your earlier point, I think I am something of an outlier still. I did write the book to suggest, if someone wanted to do this, here are some things that you might want to think about, you might want to emulate. But I've met a lot of people, and they try to plug into this stuff, and it's not that easy or natural for a lot of folks. Like, you can get some energy. You know, another thing, Demetri, too, that is a bit of a head fake is that there are candidates who really invest very, very heavily on social media. Let's say they're young. I'm thinking of a couple of congressional candidates, and they get like a little bit of a following, and be like tens of thousands of followers. And typically they show up on election day and get crushed because, like, who's still voting? What's the average age of the Iowan voter in the caucuses I participated in? I won the Iowa youth straw poll, beat Bernie. And I got crushed when the caucuses started because the average age of an Iowa caucus voter was something like 50. You know, so if I'm like building up this like great social media presence, like, is grandma, you know, like sitting there like clicking on all my videos? Like, probably not. I mean, she's probably chilling. Maybe she turns on some cable news, like sees some ads, and, you know, and then shows up and does what her peers or her party leaders tell her to do. So that there is a bit of a head fake element to this. I think the numbers I saw said something like maybe like 15% of these primary voters are on Twitter, as an example. So there's that aphorism, Twitter is not real life. So, you know, if you want to try and make things happen on a shoestring, social media, very powerful tool. Like, you know, I got a lot of value out of it and still do to this day. Forwardparty.com, it's great. But if you want to try and reach voters, the most powerful medium is still TV, which I know you wince to say it, but it's true.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that a bit more because, you know, that's an area that I've had personal experience in, having had a TV show and a radio show and now having a podcast. I'm going to move the second part of our conversation to the overtime, Andrew. And just to let listeners know where my head is at, you mentioned demographics. That's an avenue for further conversation. But, you know, you and I have both, I think did you interview David Shore on your podcast?
I did not. I would love to, though.
So we had him on our podcast. And we also had Michael Lind, who wrote a book called The New Class War. Michael really helped me think about the sort of inequities in our country, not just in terms of money, which is where I had thought about them up until then, the disparity between wealth and income and wealth more broadly, but in terms of power. And that's something I do want to ask you about. But in terms of David Shore, David got me to think about the polarization in our country, rather than thinking about it politically, which is something we talked about earlier, thinking about the dividing line as being fundamentally between those who trust the existing power structure and those who fundamentally distrust it.
I agree
so that's
with that.
Something else I want to talk to you about. We're also going to discuss UBI, and we're going to talk about some of the economic impacts of UBI, both on the plus side and on the negative side that you thought about, because we've had some sort of empirical evidence that we can pull from.
Well, I just want to speak to the trust thing. And so here's a fact I cite in my book that I think speaks volumes. 69% of Democrats have high trust in media. Only 15% of Republicans say the same.
Yeah.
Like, Republicans at this point are the anti-institutionalists. Fuck you. You're lying to me. You're full of shit. And then the Democrats are like, no, it's working. Just like, give it time, you know, trust the experts and the rest of it. Independents are between those two extremes at 36%. And I think this may be one of the defining elements of the parties at this point.
Totally. I couldn't agree more. And I do want to ask you about that more on the other side of this conversation. And I also want to ask you about something which you haven't talked about in the book. And to the extent that you've thought about it, I'd love to hear your thoughts, which is foreign policy, something that we've discussed at length on this podcast with all sorts of experts, including the former Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter. And again, media I mentioned at the top. So for anyone who is new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second part of today's conversation with Andrew, as well as the transcripts and rundowns to this episode and every other episode we've ever done, head over to hiddenforces.io and check out our episode library or subscribe directly through our Patreon page at patreon.com/hiddenforces. There's also a link in the summary page to this episode with instructions on how to connect the overtime feed to your phone so that you can listen to these extra discussions just like you listen to the regular podcast. Andrew, stick around. We're going to move the second half of our conversation to the subscriber overtime. For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to overtime segments, episode transcripts, and show rundowns full of links and detailed information related to each and every episode, check out our premium subscription available through the Hidden Forces website or through our Patreon page at patreon.com/hiddenforces. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.